Okay, well, we have a lot to talk about, so might as well get kicking. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for ZEBx's first Decarb Lunch of 2026. My name is Natalie Douglas, and I'm the Program Manager for ZEBx at the Zero Emissions Innovation Center, otherwise known as ZEEC. Today's webinar, What's the Data Telling Us? Insights on the Step Codes, takes a look at what thousands of energy models from completed Part 9 homes across BC between 2020 and 2024 are telling us. We'll dig into how things are going, where progress is showing up, and what practical approaches can help us keep momentum going to reduce carbon emissions in residential construction. This isn't meant to be a formal research presentation. Our speakers really wanted to make this a candid, informed conversation where we lean into the nuance and reflect openly on the findings. We'll agree on some things and disagree on others. And for me, this is kind of the perfect way to kick off the year. ZEBx is here to help us not only build better from a technical standpoint, but also support the broader social and procedural conditions that make real change possible. We try to create spaces where ideas can be exchanged, lessons can be shared, and where having honest, productive conversations really feels possible and productive. So today is about recognizing really how far we've come. A lot of the people in the room can definitely join us in that celebration and also spend some time, coming together to figure out how we can keep people on board, sustain momentum, and make sure that these necessary changes in our building practices really stick. Now, before we dive into the really interesting stuff, the actual content, I did want to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Tk'emlúp's territory within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation in interior BC. So as always, a big thanks to the City of Vancouver and BC Hydro, whose financial support allows us to offer these free webinars for the benefit of all industry. My colleague Victoria is now going to drop some details about getting continuing education credits for attending today's webinar, and she'll throw that into the chat. Please use the chat to ask questions and add relevant resources or events or provide comments for the presenters. I'll definitely reference that for the discussion at the end of the hour. And maybe with that, Victoria, you can launch the first poll to help us get a sense of who is in the room today. And I'll pass things over to three familiar faces to many folks, I'm sure, in the world of home building. Pauline Rupp, Director of Technical and Building Innovation at the Canadian Home Builders Association of BC, Mark Bernhardt, President of Bernhardt Contracting, and Henri Belisle, President of TQ Construction. Over to you, Pauline.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Before diving in, today's session is really about exploring multiple perspectives on the step codes, grounded in the latest data that we have. I'll start by setting the context and walking you through some of the data, and then we'll launch into the more important, interesting conversation with our panelists, who will add some color and nuance. We really encourage attendees to listen with an open mind. And a quick disclaimer, the views shared today reflect individual members' experiences and perspectives. Not necessarily the association overall. With over 2,300 member companies, there is no shortage of opinions. So I'm going to start with a bit of background first. You may know CHBA BC as the residential construction advocate. What's lesser known is that CHBA BC is a licensed service organization that works with a network of energy advisors to deliver energy labeling across British Columbia. We're also a BC Housing approved education provider, developing and delivering training for all continuing professional development and builder licensing needs. CHBA BC supports knowledge mobilization. That's a fancy term for turning research into practical application. So we applied this approach to our Codes Acceleration Fund project. So we started with a benchmarking study to get a better picture of how low-rise new housing actually performs across British Columbia today. And then from there, we tested a series of hypotheses against this data to see what it could tell us about design choices and which ones really matter when it comes to reducing operational carbon. Based on what we learned from the benchmarking study, we developed both in-person and e-learning training. Our goal was simple. We're here to help industry professionals use real data to make informed business decisions about the homes they're building. We even invited guest speakers from Technical Safety BC and BC Hydro and Fortis to address common misconceptions. And on a broader scale, the results of this project was hoping to contribute to the development of operational carbon emission provisions under the national model codes, as well as potential amendments to the BC Building Code. A little bit about the data set. So we collected nearly 7,000 built homes built between 2020 all the way to almost the end of 2025. The asterisk there is that the 2025 data was added later as a little bit of a Christmas gift from our developers. So we are able to assess a little bit of more current data. And the homes that we are looking at are covering climate zones 4 to 7A, with the majority of these homes, roughly 80%, situated in climate zone 4, which is that yellow region you see at the bottom. Here's a quick breakdown of homes based off of the energy and carbon steps. So you'll notice they're not all at the minimum. On the left-hand side, we have the energy step code. Step 3, for those of you who may not remember, was mandated as of May 1st of 2023. So we do have in the light gray a subset of homes that were permitted prior to the step code being required. And on the right, we have the zero carbon step code. And as of March 10th of 2025, the emissions level 1, which is EL1, was mandated. So in the case of the zero carbon step code, you really see that the majority of these homes, being that they were from 2020 to 2024, were not actually designed specifically for zero carbon step code compliance. In terms of trends, you'll see that nearly 60% of the homes for step 4 and step 5, they were built actually in the later part of the years. So that's 2023 to 2024. And what's really interesting is actually on the far right-hand side with the light green, you see that more homes were able to achieve the EL4 or emissions level 4 level than when you compare it to step 4 and step 5 combined. So kind of a moment of, wonder what's going on there. More on that later. And here we have a snapshot of the operational greenhouse gas intensity. So in that dark blue line, that's our BC industry average for low-rise residential. And we've included in the orange dots 2 reference points. So in 2021, we looked at only the step 1 homes. What is the average greenhouse gas intensity for that? Roughly at about 10.3. And then in 2023, when Energy Step 3 was mandated, we looked at only the average of Step 3 homes. That is roughly 9.2. In terms of how that industry average compares to this reference point, I mean, the trends are good. We're looking at quarter reductions from 2023 at a 6.9 greenhouse gas intensity. And then in only 2 years' time, so 2025, we're more than 50% lower than that reference point from 2023. That's pretty phenomenal. What I do want to point out too, though, is there are regional variation from this. So this is we're showing here in that blue line is a BC average. We have observed that for climate zones 6 and above, the averages are higher. So for 2025, we have roughly 6.9 as the average for the colder climate zones. And this is where we start to launch into more of a conversation with Mark and Henri. So Mark and Henri, when we started looking at all this data, they said, you know, what about the majority? Like we know what the average is, but how are the majority performing? So in this case, we added in, if we were to have one standard deviation away from this average, which is roughly 34% of that group, that's what you see in the shaded blue and shaded orange regions. What you'll notice that the variance from the average is pretty wide. So we were averaging for the industry in the province 4.3. But when you account for this majority, you're, at about a 8.3 for the greenhouse gas intensity. And this is not outliers. I just want to clarify that. This is like a late majority group.
Yeah, and I think this is where the data really starts getting interesting and even in somewhat political because when we're running around in our various policy circles and maybe advocating for different policies to be here or there, it's not so much the people that are below that dark blue line, right? The average, the best people who are doing the best for whatever reason, there's a bunch of reasons to do that. Those ones, like, we're done. Like they're all good, and there's a big chunk of builders there that we're really not worried about. It's the chunk of builders above that line that are the ones that potentially could be in trouble with higher regulation, and those are the builders that perhaps need a way to find themselves closer to that line.
Yeah, that's bang on. And I think part of it is that our region's gone through like a pretty rapid pace of change, not just around uh, specifically energy performance, but a number of codes and standards have changed. And I feel like there's some folks who just seem to learn and adopt a little slower. And so they're the folks who kind of adapt as they are required to, as opposed to builders like Mark or myself, where we kind of like
Mm.
charge right into the education, get in front of things, and make sure that you're ready. And I think my personal concern is that if we don't consider some strategies on how to manage that and ease that transition, is we might just lose our capacity or lose some capacity to deliver housing overall, because there's only so
Mhm.
many builders who can build so many homes per year, and we can all agree that we're not building enough. Uh, and so I think that's where a big part of our challenge is on like manage the change management aspect of it.
When we start losing the political will at that point as well, right? If we
Hmm.
have this somewhat large group of industry hating it and fighting it, then that muddies those gears pretty badly to get and it in really like the builders that are below the line probably aren't going to say anything because they're doing fine and they're going to be on their way doing their thing. But that group above, that's going to be a noisy group of builders, and they're going to have some legitimate grievances in there as well, and so then the political will starts to back up, and so from my perspective, in the might be considered on the greener side of the spectrum there, if we want to move these policies forward, I think that does need to be taken into account, and that creating the buy-in, not from the leader builders, we have that already, but from those builders who are a little bit behind the line. Not the ones that are way behind the line, like that there's nothing we can do for those folks. Those folks are just going to need regulation.
Hmm.
But there's that sort of that group that's just a little bit behind the line, and how do we get them over that line? I think is a real question.
So, question mark, when you talk about like what are some supporting tools or levers that are non-regulatory, how would you like to see them help to close this gap from the average that we're looking at in the trends?
Yeah, so this is a hard question actually, and I'm not even sure there is a real clear answer on this. The regulation I think we know how to do. We have that in place already. The question is, I think, how fast does that regulation need to move, and how big of a stick do we need to have there? But in terms of like the encouragement, I think the funnest line that I heard was from former housing minister Ravi Kahlon when he was asked about regulation, and he said, when he was asked if it was going to be a carrot or a stick approach, and he said something along the lines of it was going to be a carrot stick, and so it's going to taste good, but it's going to sting a little if we don't do it right.
Hmm.
And I think there's some merit in that, where we need to be clear about where the target is and have a clear line of sight and direction that is consistent and doesn't change or appear to waver. And what I mean by that is particularly around municipalities where we have dense municipalities, the Vancouver area of Southern Vancouver Island in particular. Most builders wouldn't necessarily be looking at the provincial timeline. They're going to be looking at the local timeline. And those local timelines are all over the place. And I think you have a
Yep.
slide coming up on that, so we can maybe circle back to that. But that interferes with the ability of an industry member to see consistency and plan ahead and say, oh, I better get on that education now because in 2 years I'm going to be doing this.
If I can add one more thing before we dive into the slide here, is that I think also there's a certain amount of creating like we talked about tools, but also incentives, is that if homeowners are seeking it out because there's a good reason for a homeowner to adopt and to advance a building standard, then builders will meet the market demand. Like a good example is both in that I know for certain is both the city of Vancouver and the city of New West offer bonus density essentially to build like New West is step 5 and EL4. If you hit that, they give you some extra square footage, and homeowners seek that out. They look for people who can meet those standards, and as opposed to bringing them the bad news, for example, that a detail that they may not prefer that to meet standard is required. Then instead they're seeking out that change, and I think that's probably the most powerful initiative. I think that will like kind of moves the market itself and builders' behavior.
So switching a little bit, we were talking about targets. And I think when we were talking about how to close the gap, you kind of hinted, Mark, some are going to say, oh, that's easy, just mandate higher steps. So then our next kind of set of hypothesis was, well, okay, let's look at what is the difference between step 3 and step 4, specific to operational greenhouse gas emissions. And so we kind of dug into the data to give us, how that actually compares. And when we look at it, we're really seeing there's marginal differences in the operational greenhouse gas emissions when you're comparing step 3 to step 4 homes. And that's something that is, needs to be considered. There are benefits for sure to higher energy steps that are perhaps side benefits or comfort benefits. But when you're looking for specifically the policies of how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're not necessarily seeing those as being significantly impactful between the energy step code. So I guess the question for you guys is, where we do see the impact is potentially going from reporting only, which is emissions level 1, to emissions level 2. So in our case for step 3, we saw, on average a 64% reduction there. Can you walk me through what is the level of effort here for change management and time when going from EL1 to EL2?
My opinion, it's pretty minimal. Like the changes required in the design of the home aren't as steep as if going from say EL1 to EL4, which can change how you have to approach the home and some of the decisions a homeowner can make. And I think from a contractor's perspective, it's much more straightforward and is pretty like I haven't heard many of my peers really gripe or complain about this step. It's more of any concern I've ever heard or in discussions that we're had have been around municipalities that have leapt to EL4, and then it's kind of created a bit of friction in the building and planning process.
Yeah, I mean, my South Vancouver Island perspective on this is a little bit maybe different because the level of effort is, I think it depends on where you are. Southern Vancouver Island, I would say the effort is somewhere around zero. But to do this, it's already part of the building culture in many ways. But then, our projects in, some of the central interior areas and into Vancouver, that's where we start running into much more of like what Henri was alluding to, where, clients for whatever cultural reason, and I say cultural as like broad, like my parents always had like in-floor radiant heating. So that's part of, my culture. That's what I mean. Or I've always had gas cooking, so that's what I know, although gas cooking isn't accounted for in these. So it's things like that, that really sort of halts that momentum, and that's where the builders are having their friction point. It's not that they can't do it. Like Henri said, if clients came to us and asked every builder, "Oh, can you build me a net zero house?" No self-respecting builder is going to say, "No, I can't build a net zero house." They'll do it, and so I see that as more of a cultural thing, where people are used to a certain system and that's what they ask for, and builders aren't necessarily fighting with that or don't want to fight with that, and shouldn't necessarily be the ones to be fighting with that.
Yeah, and on your point about being used to a system, I think that's a big part of it. Is Well, builders we're pretty creative people and like exploring novelty. I think part of how we make our businesses successful is by repeatedly applying like the same principles and disciplines throughout projects, even though you might have a different floor plan, different architectural layout, using similar details, similar systems. Use your trades, know how you like to work it, and so managing the change incrementally allows us to kind of refine and get really efficient with how we approach it, as opposed to kind of like I was talking to a builder. Sorry if I'm rambling here, but just last week about how he's been building as close as he can to step 5 for about 10 years. Um, and every single house that he's built has used different details all along the way because the standards have changed also along the way, whether it's the local municipalities, whether it's engineering loads, whether it's mechanical changes. So it's the more efficient we can get as an industry, the more easily we can deliver these homes.
Yeah. And I think that change is slow a lot as well. And we think of like even dual energy heating systems, right? Like really that's the difference in many cases between EL1 and EL2 is, is a dual energy heating system. And in cases where that's appropriate, that in many ways becomes like a bit of a gateway drug, right? If we are going to fully electric, the gateway drug is a dual energy system. And because now you've tried it and now you've got that system that you've known for 100 years and you're comfortable with and you know who the repairman is for that. But now we've got this newfangled thing that we're maybe not quite as comfortable with, but it's okay because I've still got my other thing over there. And then, eventually perhaps that transitions to just having this newfangled thing.
So that actually leads into this next one because naturally Henry, you've already kind of talked about the friction points tend to be on the higher emission level steps. And, on paper, gosh, this looks great. Like we know that little green box has very low carbon to it. But we've also had a lot of discussions at our technical committee level, Mark, about what are the caution flags, like in order to get the buy-in to move the needle, what are these specific things that we really need to think hard about and have actions against so that we can be successful in the transition over enough period of time? Want to comment on, I guess, the Canadian Electrical Code or regional considerations?
I mean, I've got a lot of comments on the Canadian Electrical Code. We don't
Yeah.
have time for that. But again, back to my earlier comment about creating buy-in, right? Like this is in many ways is a political game. I don't see the challenge here necessarily in the whether or not we can do it. We absolutely can do it. We know that builders have done it. Our team's done it multiple times, and we've done it very cost effectively. But that doesn't create, just because somebody has done it, and particularly somebody who is used to building high performance homes, doesn't necessarily mean anything for the mass industry. Creating that buy-in from the mass industry, those people above the line, requires us to remove every barrier possible. And any little speed bump in the line will cause friction and resentment and then potentially push us off that pathway. And so for that reason, like EL3 is it's it's sort of an intermediate step, and often we find is actually hard to hit. You often hit it by accident, but if the big reduction is going from EL1 to EL2, that's major bang for your buck. Then going from EL2 to EL4 is another big bang for your buck, but those bucks get a bumpy road along the way. And if we can do things about Canadian Electrical Code, like panel sizing, all those little things that are stuck in there in a very, very outdated way, things like load sharing with not just EVs, but with everything, that would remove a lot of friction and help industry buy into this concept. And I think that's something very easy to do. It doesn't cost us anything as a country. It doesn't compromise safety. It doesn't compromise environment. And I would personally suggest that we do that before we try and go to EL4 for places that haven't already gone. Just because you help create that buy-in. It allows us to go to industry and say, here, we've got you this present. Here's your pony. Now we would ask that you go and do this, and that would be, I think, the
Yeah.
easiest path forward.
Yeah, that's bang on. Like you alluded to, Mark, like the way the load calculations are done just can make getting anything like makes most single family homes we're involved in push up to 200 amps as their service sizing. And I know from talking to folks who've followed actual like energy usage and monitoring data is that most homes above step 3 or 4 don't really demand anywhere close to 100 amps anywhere throughout the year. So we're kind of over engineering and over designing it. And in some areas, it can make like service upgrades just can be incredibly challenging or borderline not possible just due to weird conflicts between jurisdictions, site uses, easements. If some jurisdictions, a service upgrade can cost like $50,000. Like if you're doing an underground service connection in the wrong place, it can totally blow out a homeowner's budget or developer's budget for a project, and it essentially can make what would be a significant upgrade from whatever was there into essentially a non-viable project. You just leave a 1960s house on the property instead of building a new one. We're doing a significant update to it. So I think there's definitely some work around, actually it's out of our hands locally. It's a federal issue, but I think the Canadian Electric Code itself, like I don't think the way a base load calculation is done has changed since like the 70s or 80s. And we can all agree that never mind high performance, just houses and their use have changed significantly since. And I think we have a lot better data. So I think if that hump can be managed, then I think there's not the barriers to moving to EL4 kind of drop pretty significantly.
So it sounds like in order to get to these higher levels, like we'd really be expecting a lot more provincial action on these enabling regulation changes.
Yeah. There's just no reason for those regulations to be there anymore. They're just outdated and they're causing us unnecessary friction. So let's get rid of them.
You're here.
Yeah.
So in terms of regionalized data, because we looked at some provincial-wide data when it comes to heating systems, both on space heating and hot water, and we realized, that doesn't really tell the story. And where you start to see this nuance in color is when you start to look at it at a regional level. So I'm going to start with Metro Vancouver. Hold your horses, Mark. I'm going to get to you on the next one. But Henri, so we're acknowledging that there are a lot of regional differences here. And, what are you making of these trends in terms of options available for system selection and, the transition to dual fuel specific to Metro Vancouver?
Thanks, Pauline. Yeah, so I as you can gather, I talk to a lot of homeowners throughout my day job. And I think one thing that's really common, like just looking at the fuel heat as nearly 50% or fuel heat with AC, basically 3/4 of all of the homes here. I think the big drivers are, one is it's a lot of homes that have been built basically in Metro Vancouver since the mid 80s. The majority of them, at least custom homes, have included some form of like hydronic radiant heat, which is essentially exceedingly difficult or expensive to do these days through like an air to water heat pump. And then naturally people just bolting an AC onto there. And I find that a lot of the folks we talk to are just kind of romanticize it. Like it's a lot of like Mark alluded to culture, and I think that's what it's about. It's I grew up with it. I grew up having, whether it's a boiler and never running out of hot water, or having a centralized furnace. Like I've a funny thing. I think there's also a bit of just I don't know, polarization might be the right word, but I've had funny conversations with people where they're like, I want an AC, but I don't want a heat pump. And I have to like explain to them, like,
they're the same thing.
They're basically the same thing here.
Yeah.
And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna like slowly back away from this conversation and try to reset here and kind of make sure we're on the same page. But I think you kind of just see that there's a bit of like the culture of the region. Like Mark alluded to the South Island, which I know we'll cover in a moment. And I think you kind of see adoption based on how that works. I think there's a real attachment to like cooking with gas, which I think people associate and tie back to their heating system, even though it's not actually required as part of the energy step code or regulated. You can still have a natural gas connection for your barbecue, etc. And when we move to step 4 and 5, I think it just shows that what we're seeing in a lot of areas is a lot of new housing. Almost every project we do, when we're doing like a substantial piece of work, you're seeing folks add heat pumps, add air conditioning. And so end up in kind of either a dual energy system, or just essentially going to a full heat pump. And largely, I think that's just because that's the best way to make the models work once you start advancing up the energy step code.
Yeah. All right, I had to insert this Onion article. So if anyone doesn't know, the Onion is satirical news, so it's not real. Please don't be offended. But I thought it really captured this paradox of what we've been talking about, what consumers may publicly favor some actions, but what their behaviors at home are, like how they're willing to actually change when it comes to their own home, may actually be in conflict sometimes with public sentiment. So Mark, you said in the past, builders don't want to be dream killers. Like, we want to provide what the consumers are asking for. So yeah, how do you see this shift in cultural mentality where this is what works, this is what I'm comfortable using, um, to this next level of kind of a low carbon future?
Yeah, I think your newspaper article there is great. Like, oh, the bus is for everybody else, but I'm going to stay in my car. And it is exactly a very good point, I think, about people's housing as well. Environment and climate change, that's all for somebody else to deal with, and we don't really consider that in our daily lives in terms of our house. You go and buy that fair trade coffee or something and feel really good about yourself for the day, and that's enough for the environment, but you don't consider your house or your big car that you got in to get there. Um, I actually see this though, these two graphs in particular. I mean, Vancouver Island's, the culture is in terms of building is a little bit different there. And I think a lot of that comes from the history of access to different fuels. And even though we know that Victoria, I believe, actually had the oldest coal gas system in the province way back in the day. Not sure if that was continuously in place or what, but it was definitely there way back in the day. But for a long time, there wasn't the easy access through the pipeline, and so the culture of radiant floor heating in particular didn't necessarily build up in the same way. And I think that's probably the primary reason why we see Vancouver Island in the place that it is. And the Thompson Okanagan is sort of almost the reverse. That one, the culture of AC is very ingrained and for very good reason, the heat. But to me, this is not necessarily a bad news story. This is a very low-hanging fruit story, right? The education piece here is not that you need to have some sort of heat pump in the system. The education here is that the heat pump is already there, and we just need to change its function. And this is something I think that's been a real positive, good news story, particularly in the Thompson Okanagan region. In our own business, we are seeing a very big uptake and a switch from that gas with AC to dual energy. So I think I would be willing to bet that the 2026 numbers are significantly different. They're not going to be Vancouver Island, but they're going to be significantly different. That gas with AC is really dropping off. I'll give the Fortis rebate program some credit on that as well, because it does require that it be a heat pump, not just a straight AC. And I think that has been very effective at changing the hearts and minds, or at least opening people to the idea, and moving them away from just pushing them slightly out of that comfort zone into that zone where they're willing to look at that heat pump. And the results we're seeing are quite good, not just in the homes themselves and the comfort and the energy bills, but that sort of cultural change. I see it as a good news story.
So kind of incremental pieces for buy-in
Yeah.
for the greater good.
Exactly. And it's back to that sort of carrot and stick approach, right? A rebate program that helps people take that little bit of a leap. And it's a small leap, but it is still a little bit of a leap.
Mm-hmm.
That's the carrot approach, right? And I have seen it be very effective. And again, back to that Fortis program there, in the Kootenays, it is now rare for us to see a house that is not step four. And I would credit that to that program, because people are making that change. And so an incentive can push people to something. And then if we remove the barriers once they get there, I think once that incentive program inevitably ends, there's no backslide.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of jumped into this a little earlier on, Mark, about this jurisdictional adoption and the timelines in which we are doing it currently. Apologies, this is not a BC-wide snapshot of step code adoption, and I
It'd
guess
be too messy if it was.
it is overwhelming. I will say it was quite a lot of homework to get to this particular snapshot. It's not as easy as one would think in order to actually gauge which jurisdiction is mandating which step at which point in time. So I guess a little bit of a free-for-all, like what we're seeing, this is what happens when you let all the jurisdictions select their own steps. They all have different implementation timelines. So how do you see us kind of moving forward towards greater harmonization, so that
Yeah.
back to this idea, Henry, you had about we're trying to just refine our product over time.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have consistently different requirements in your neighboring jurisdictions that really kind of prevents us from making these small adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a time machine, I would say if we could harmonize the step code implementation from when we started across our current timeline that across all municipalities, that would probably be the easiest way for industry to adapt. Can't do that. Haven't quite figured out the technology there. But I do think that I think as we move ahead, I think I would like to see is essentially TQ Construction's opinion. That essentially municipalities kind of hold to what the provincial targets are and then kind of allow it to carry forward, so that anyone who is building in that region can essentially, like if you were to look at this in 2 years, it's kind of still looks the same, so to speak. So if you're submitting a permit on something you're designing today, it's complicated and big, and then you're not having to like redesign partway through that process because on the specific date your step code changed. I think if there's anything in terms of like managing, changing, and allowing industry to catch up, I think that would be my ask.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more on that. I think, and I've said before, is that I think the biggest mistake of the step code program was making it a voluntary adoption, and not having that provincial timeline be set and forced along a specific timeline. They were originally set the steps 2 years apart because that's about how long it takes for a small builder to build a house, learn how to do it, and then move on to the next one. And you allow time for that change. Now that said, like, did it matter when Victoria went to EL4? Like, not really, because they were already almost there. So it's not to say that municipalities have caused problems, but at the same time, every map looks like this. Every location in the province looks like this, and our team serves everywhere basically except this map. And so that's like 65, 70 some municipalities, all with their own policy. It is an enormous business expense to try and keep up with that. And so we could do this a lot more efficiently. I think the good news is theoretically in 2032, we are probably all going to be on the same thing. At least that's the stated intent. But that's there's going to be a lot of resistance in between here and then, and the fact that we're not all marching on the same step here is, I think, a big contributing factor to that.
Yeah.
I can't even count the number of permit applications we've messed up because we got it wrong based on what the municipality needed or wanted or what have you. Never mind the submission differences.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it also prevents contractors or disincentivizes builders from moving to different and working in different markets. Like I know some who will only work in like, if you look at this map, they're like, well, I will work in Burnaby and New West. I learned those building departments. I learned what I do. That's what I do. Same thing goes for the North Shore, Vancouver. So there's plenty of folks who just don't work in certain municipalities because of their code approach as well. And I think the more like the easier it is to move from place to place to build the same house, no matter which region it is, or as long as it's in the same climate zone, I think the better off we are.
Well, it's transferable skills, and I think it's like
Absolutely, yeah.
with builders, it's a little harder to spread out regionally,
Hmm.
and so there's maybe more incentive to be in sort of your own little area. But every other consultant, think of all the engineers, all of those
Hmm.
people too, which is a huge part of the industry. They will tend to spread out, like ourselves. We spread out around the province, and so it cannot be understated how difficult it is to work in an environment where everything is different in every location. And I think that does a real disservice to the program in general.
So one last question, kind of on the flip side, which is, local governments that want to move ahead. But if you're saying, oh, no, I need you to stick to the provincial mandate. Henri, you've mentioned, there's some great examples of
Hmm.
incentives. Like, what would you say for these local governments right now that want to leap forward in this environment of harmonization?
My opinion is that any incentives around that promote like better building that are tied to either additional FSR, like site coverage, building height, etc., is a win-win for both the municipality and the homeowner, because the homeowner has like a real financial incentive to like take on any potential extra expense for a higher performance standard. So say you take on an extra 50,000 of build costs because you have to go from step 3 to step 5 in your region, or net zero or passive, whichever. But then you say you have a house that's 19% bigger, and then the city is able to, they'll charge their DCCs at 19% more because they charge it based on FSR. So there's more income for the municipality for those projects. And then it also increases the tax base of that property too, because it's larger and more valuable. Then on a recurring basis, they can get more income. And they also would be able to meet their climate goals. So I think there is a healthy win-win. Again, talking about the carrot stick. I think if there's a way to align the incentives so that homeowners want it, builders are happy to do it, and it makes good sense for the city. Uh, that's what I would like to see. I think it works really well in Vancouver. You see folks, as well as in the West, you see folks seeking it out, saying like, I'd like to do this, and I know this incentive's available. Can we design this to net zero or to passive? And I think that's what you want, because when the homeowners are asking for it, like it'll get built.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things we've seen in industry a lot is that some municipalities will collect a little bit of money and say, well, like $500 if you get there. Like $500 does not win hearts and minds. Like it's enough money that I'll bend over and pick that up off the street, but it's not enough money to get me to change the design of my house. And we can't afford to do these, relatively expensive cash rebate programs. So I think Henry's right. We have to think more creatively about how we can encourage housing. And I think the density bonus is definitely the way to go in encouraging that higher steps. And then I would love to tell, all the municipalities that are racing to those top steps, there are a few that are determined to be first, is I would say, let's arrive together intact rather than at a race, in shambles. And that would be more productive. Like, yes, your small municipality might get there and have a slightly lower GHG, but if we work together with all of our regional municipalities and get there at the same time, the cumulative GHG reductions of that is massive.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better.
I think we're actually like those are some powerful kind of ending notes. I know that we have one more slide, but I think that that's
We'll
actually a
just
good
come up with
place.
something more powerful then.
I did want to say, like, I know that that was a lot of data and that we definitely don't anticipate that this is the end of a conversation. In fact, we expect that there's more to come in the future. So if there is a desire to have follow-up conversation, I'm not sure if it's safe to say I'm volunteering Mark and Henry and I to be a part of that. But thank you so much for this opportunity, Natalie, and then we'll open it up, I think, for some Q&A.
Of course, yeah. And Pauline, if you could keep up your slides, that would be great just for the short term, because I see there's a couple of questions that I think would be really helpful if we could go back to, I think it was slide 7, and just go through that graph again. We chatted through this exact experience. They've been staring at this data for a while. With help, I understood what they were meaning as well, but it's a work in progress. So, Pauline, if you could kind of clarify and go back to this and speak exactly what that 34% is speaking to, I think that would be helpful to the audience.
So this is just a standard deviation. So when you think of standard deviation as a bell curve, when you look at that peak curve, there's two sides of the peak. So right in the middle is if you think that's the average. So that's our dark line there. If you start to look at the left-hand side of a bell curve, that's kind of your early majority group. So that is roughly 34%. That would be underneath this dark blue. If you look at the right-hand side of a bell curve, that standard deviation captures roughly 34% of that. And so when you combine two, that's like the majority of our data group would fall into this. So that's that 34% is the late majority. And then if you can imagine a kind of a mirror below that, that would be capturing like the majority of our entire sample. And it basically speaks to the fact that it allows you to see when you see how big that variance is, there's windows to narrow that gap. So right now our gap is pretty high in terms of the difference between the average and the top band of that 34 is at 4 greenhouse on GHGI. I think what we were trying to talk about is how do you actually narrow that variance so that it's not so wide, so that we're actually much closer to the average as a the majority of the
We want to
population
make a
in the
skinny
stat.
bell curve instead of a wide bell curve. And right now we've got
Exactly.
kind of a wide bell curve.
And
Sorry, hopefully that explained.
Yeah.
if I can add something too, is I think it's worth. There was a previous slide that had a lot more lines on this that showed a bunch of other targets, and I just want to describe it briefly, but because I think it's important to know that like this variance here seems pretty manageable, but as we increase the standards, it becomes much more challenging as we approach that um, the target in 2030 of like basically as close to zero as we can. So if you think of the delta we have now and how many emissions we have to make up over time, like that window gets much tighter, and the allowable variance between where we are and like in this 34%, like we're currently below the step three line within one standard deviation. But if as we advance that, it'll become even more challenging to make up that gap. And I think that's part of the issue we're seeing, or thing
Yeah.
to manage, best way to put
Yeah,
it.
and as we go towards 2030 there, right? And if Clean BC continues on the path that it is and down to the EL4 level, I think like the dark blue line, the average looks pretty good. Like it might be on target to hit that. Which is very encouraging. And if I want to spin this in a very encouraging way, I'd probably only show the line because it makes us all feel really good. But we also go from having maybe what 5-10% of builders being cut off above the regulation to like 50% of builders being cut off. And I'm certainly willing to tolerate cutting off the bottom end of the market. Like there's always going to be barely legal builders that maybe don't need to be builders anymore. But that's probably more of the market than we can afford at that rate. And so I'm hopeful that that would shrink and our bell curve would become more of a peak. But I think the only way we do that is if we have a very clear pathway, very consistent, and very predictable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that definitely offers a little bit more nuance. Again, folks are encouraged to check out these slides when we publish them, and maybe we can add some of those old graphs if we'd like. You can stop sharing, Pauline, if you'd like, just so you can see the chat. That might be helpful. I thought I'd highlight one question from Scott Kennedy, which I think gets at a little bit of what you guys kind of want to be talking about the nuance. I don't think you want to take away that why step three is better than step four. That's not, that is not the outcome that, the argument that you guys are making. But I do think that, are you speaking about that incentivization? Are you thinking about us trying to hit our targets as a province as opposed to, local wins? And I think it's really hard for all of us to talk about this stuff without being, we all want to hit the top levels, but we also don't want to lose momentum. We don't want these regulations to disappear because of political pushback. And so I think maybe addressing what are you talking about when you're highlighting the importance of step three and EL2? Um, maybe, yeah, coming back to this point, what do you want the main message to be for that building community and for local government staff?
Oof, that's a deep one. And it's also a deep one that can get us in a lot of trouble. So
What did I
luckily,
know?
luckily I enjoy getting in trouble.
Yeah. Uh,
Love it.
well, I think I'll try to speak broadly because like the message I think I would like to deliver is a broad one, which is I think is that um, like perfect is the enemy of great. Um, that like being striving and like for absolute purity and perfection in what we're doing, I think takes our eye off the ball and then stops us from like achieving a really good result. And part of what I think it's also important for us to keep in mind, I think when I gave a portion, presented some of this data at the CEMX event a few months ago, one of the things I thought is really worthwhile realizing and acknowledging for ourselves is like the delta between what we are doing here in BC and then the rest of Canada. Like less than a year ago, I attended a national housing session where the discussion was like, should you flash your windows and do rain screen? Like I'm not kidding. Like
It's bad. It's bad.
the idea of like insulating a little more or even measuring air tightness in most of the country is like largely non-existent.
Mhm.
And I think we all should be giving ourselves a pat on the back that like we have made tremendous progress in what we build here in BC. And it is, I think it's really easy to tell ourselves that we're never doing enough because that's kind of our nature, but also we are also have accomplished something like pretty incredible, and I think we are building the best buildings probably in the on the continent. Um, and I think it's worth acknowledging that, and I really do. And I think that just showing that if we are at step three EL2, we are building like likely we are building some of the best homes on the planet.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Newfoundland's just trying to figure out how to have a building code at all.
yeah, they just don't
Um,
have one.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And one of the reasons that BC, I think, has been able to be that leader and will continue to be that leader is that we have builder licensing. And I would say for all step programs, tier code, whatever, step zero of those programs is builder licensing because then we can force the education. And that allows us to do it. And but again, back to our topic there is it still needs to be slow and steady. It takes a long time to educate a workforce. And so rushing to the top doesn't necessarily serve us, and that's where mistakes happen. When mistakes happen, that makes the paper. When it makes the paper, it makes the politics, and then we run into trouble. And so that's for my motivation there is like it wouldn't like step four is definitely an improvement on step three, and step five is an improvement beyond that. But we don't need to get there today. We should get there as quickly as we can in a way that brings the majority of industry along with it.
Yeah.
Pauline, do you have any reflections?
I think just to wrap that up in terms of we've talked about this isn't just one particular segment of the industry, it's the entire sector, and that contains consultants, designers, architects, as well as the enforcement community. And what we didn't talk about is all of the other changes that this sector is bearing. Like zero star carbon step code and energy step code is one of many other changes. And so I think this idea of change management as incremental and small is still a good news story. And like there is that desire of showing progress, and I think that's what we were trying to show is there has been good progress made, and we're not trying to forget about it, and we're not trying to retreat on it. But there is this point in time I feel where some of our industry is asking for a bit of a breather, just so that they can absorb the change and then prepare and refine for the future.
Yeah, so I think that, we're coming to the end of the hour. We can talk about a lot of different topics that came in the chat, but I think getting back to, I think on one hand, we have to be realistic in the provincial context that we're in politically, but we also have to be realistic with BC is a place of a lot of climate ambition. And I think a lot of people on this call, even, they want to do better and they feel the sense of crisis in some senses about where we're at and that 2030 is coming very quick. And I think Andy mentioned in the chat, 2030 is that point where we might be at that harmonization where the step code is, we're no longer going to be in this system that we've known for the past little while that always had this, system that we always are continuously getting better. And so I think coming back to, you know, the balance between regional specificity and flexibility and harmonization is this fact that we're probably going to continue to see some folks, some local governments going forward requiring EL4 because that feels like the best option to hit their climate action targets. Is the main, takeaway from looking at this data from your experience that at least harmonize across regions? This is not new news, but is that kind of the call out? Like, if we can harmonize, just recognize that. And as another takeaway, we're doing pretty well. The earth is not going to fall out from underneath us if we go to EL2 and then
Mhm.
continue to build skill in our building community. Like, what are your reflections on that? I'm an ambitious person. I want to push really hard, but I also don't, I want to see where this middle ground is. So am I getting that right? What do you have, differing
Yeah.
opinions on that?
No, I think you got it right. And well said on that too. Is like, my personal feelings are like all of our projects will be EL4 step five going forward, and they have been for quite a long time. That's not going to change. And I find that cost effective and easy to do. There's a significant amount of the industry that hasn't discovered that yet. And I always, yeah, I liken it back to that being able to create buy-in. For a number of years now, I've been trying to teach builders how to do the same thing we've been doing, and it is difficult. It is slow. And if we don't take the time to do it and allow, not forever, it can't be forever. It cannot be a excruciatingly slow process. But it's a process. It's not going to
Yeah.
be as fast as I might like.
Henry, do you have any
Yeah.
reflections?
Yeah, no, I think Mark summarized it well. I think it's about managing pace of adoption and pace of change. And like myself, I try to push all my clients to building as best as they can. Um, Naturally, I'm vulnerable to the market, and if someone is like adamant to build to code minimum, we will. We're not super excited about it. Uh, and I think as long, my strong opinion is that the ho homeowners are the biggest barrier for us to overcome. And I think the homeowner and the home buyer is looking for a better built home, then the market will advance towards that. And I think there are more reasons for the more reason a homeowner and home buyer have to like say, I'm going to build a custom home, I'm going to renovate to this standard, I'm going to do a development, and I want it to hit X target. Then the more builders, designers, architects will just be happily involved in that because that means getting the job. And if you want to motivate builders, just make sure that, we'll do it to get the job. Like that's basically it. Like if we know we can build the house we want to build, then we'll do it. Uh, and but if the homeowners are resistant to it, then so will we, because they're the ones we ultimately work for, are responsible to, and have to deliver for. They're the ones who are using the housing. And I think that sometimes I think we get lost in that conversation of between like home designers, builders, municipalities, and then oftentimes we leave the actual end user of the product and their motivations and desires out of the thought process. I think they need to be communicated and incentivized towards adoption.
Yeah. I think that, there's some discussion in the chat already about um, this being a cultural problem in a lot of ways. And I
Hmm.
think all of us would probably agree with that in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The exact way in which we move forward, we all might disagree slightly, but I think that how this community, and especially obviously ZEBx has generally folks on this call are going to be those interested in pursuing zero emissions buildings, trying to make this
Of
a
course.
reality. And so
Mhm.
I think what role do we have? I think from the local government side, maybe it is this incentives piece, especially during this time of the economic reality that we're in. But also trying to get creative on opening up spaces where it doesn't feel like a binary of them against us. I
Hmm.
know that's, said all the time, but I think we need to state it again that this is, we're in a really great part of the world that we can still have a lot of really tough conversations. And I think continuing to nourish that in whatever space all the building practitioners on this call, like continue to have those tough conversations. Like Henry, you're having those conversations about heat pumps. Maybe eventually they'll be like, heat pumps are actually pretty great.
Yeah.
Be in a home that they're like, this is a very comfortable space to be in.
Hmm.
So I think with that, we could talk for a very long time. I
We
think
could
that,
go on all afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
we
I can clear my
started this,
schedule. Yeah.
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about this being kind of more like a podcast. But we have a 1 hour session. This is our classic decarb lunch. We know you guys are busy. Very grateful for those that joined today. And Pauline, Mark, Henry for sharing your thoughts. I think there's going to be more information provided when all of this data actually gets released. And ZEBx will help elevate any decisions that CHBA BC does take in releasing that information. So I'll end it there. Thanks so much, everyone, for having this really frank and honest conversation. It's what helps us move forward.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.
Thank you.